My name is May T. Espinoza. I'm 28 years old, and I grew up in one of those families where the favoritism was so obvious it almost felt insulting that everyone kept pretending it was subtle. My older sister, Kayla, is 31 now. She was the golden child in our house, the kind of daughter who could have burned the place down and somehow my parents would have blamed the wiring, the curtains, the weather, anything except her. Meanwhile, I was the extra child. The one they remembered after they had already spent all their energy, all their patience, and apparently all their softness. Growing up in suburban Ohio, I learned early that our house had two completely different rule books, Kayla's rules and everybody else's. Kayla could stay out until midnight on school nights because she was building social confidence. I had to be home by 8 because I needed structure. Kayla could quit every activity she ever touched because she was finding herself. I had to stay in band for 4 straight years. Even though I hated the clarinet so much, I used to sit in the parking lot before practice and fantasize about throwing it into traffic, because commitment builds character. The double standard was so shameless it would have been funny if it hadn't been my actual life. When Kayla was 17, she wrecked my dad's car by driving straight into a mailbox while texting. The front bumper was crumpled, the headlight shattered, and she came home crying like she was the victim of some random cosmic attack. 2 weeks later, my parents bought her a used Honda. Their explanation was that she needed a safer car so she could learn from her mistake. Learn from it. Like financial rescue was somehow a lesson. The same year, I got a B+ on a chemistry test. 1 B+. My mother sat me down at the kitchen table for a 2-hour talk about wasted potential. I still remember the way she looked at me, like I had personally embarrassed generations of our bloodline over a quiz on ionic bonds. She spoke in that disappointed voice that somehow hurt worse than yelling. Kayla could destroy property and get rewarded. I could slip 1 inch below perfection and get treated like a warning sign. School was its own kind of theater. Kayla pulled average grades at best, sometimes worse. A C on her report card would trigger some dramatic family speech about perseverance and resilience. My parents would take her out to dinner, buy her something new, tell her how proud they were of her effort. Effort. I was bringing home straight A's so consistently it stopped mattering. Once I made honor roll for the 6th straight semester, and my mother barely looked up before saying, "Well, you're supposed to do well." That sentence stayed with me longer than she probably ever intended. You're supposed to do well. No joy, no pride, no warmth, just obligation. Like achievement was my rent for being allowed to exist in the house. Holidays were worse because favoritism wrapped in Christmas paper feels especially cruel. Christmas morning at our place always looked like Santa had a personal issue with me. Kayla's pile of gifts could block a doorway. Mine looked like an afterthought assembled at a gas station on the drive home. Socks, a calculator, gift cards to stores I never even shopped at. One year, she unwrapped a gaming console, the newest phone, and somehow a dirt bike, while I got a toolkit and a scarf. My mother's explanation was that Kayla needed more because she appreciated things differently. I still have no idea what that means. I'm pretty sure I would have appreciated a dirt bike just fine. Birthdays followed the same script. Kayla's birthdays were events, rented spaces, decor, trays of catered food, everybody invited, pictures taken like she was royalty, making a public appearance. Mine were treated like administrative burdens. Every year my mother would ask, in that careful tone that made the answer obvious, "Do you even want a party this year?" By 14, I stopped pretending I didn't hear what she actually meant. I told them not to bother. It was easier to kill expectation than keep watching it starve. My father was Kayla's loudest believer. Every mediocre thing she did became family legend. Kayla made JV soccer as a sophomore, and he threw a party. Kayla graduated high school with a 2.1 GPA, and he cried. Real tears. When I graduated salutatorian and got a full academic scholarship to Ohio State, my father patted me on the shoulder, said, "Good job," and then asked if I had seen Kayla's new boots. That was the moment something in me changed for good. I had a full ride to a major university. I had done everything right without help, without applause, without softness, and still somehow a pair of boots got more excitement than my future. The thing about being the child who doesn't matter is that eventually you stop asking to matter. You stop waiting for the look of pride that never comes. You stop rehearsing your good news in the mirror. You stop hoping anyone will show up for you in the way you've watched them show up for someone else your whole life. At some point, you just put your head down and do it yourself, because hoping starts to feel more humiliating than silence. That's what I did. I worked part-time jobs through high school and saved every dollar I could. At 14, I was bagging groceries, then stocking shelves. By 16, I was working at a local hardware store where a bunch of older guys taught me more about patience, effort, and practical life than my own parents ever had. They showed me plumbing basics, electrical work, how to fix things instead of throwing them away. They talked to me like I was capable, like I was worth teaching. One of them was a retired plumber named Carl. He had rough hands, a permanent coffee stain on his thermos, and this habit of nodding slowly before he said anything important. One afternoon, after helping me figure out a problem with a busted sink display, he looked at me and said, "You've got a good head on your shoulders and good hands too. Stay out of trouble and you'll go far." I can still hear it. That one sentence meant more to me than almost anything my parents had ever said, probably because it wasn't inflated or fake or conditional. It was simple, honest, earned. Sometimes I still think about Carl and wonder if he had any idea how much that mattered to a girl who had spent most of her life being tolerated instead of seen. College became my exit plan, not just school, escape. 4 years of engineering at Ohio State, honors, structure, distance, a future that belonged to me. I counted down the months until I could leave that house without needing permission to do it. While Kayla drifted through minimum wage jobs and excuses and emotional emergencies that somehow always required my parents' money, I kept building, quietly, carefully. Like if I stacked enough proof around myself, nobody would ever be able to rewrite my life as luck. By 25, I had saved enough for a down payment on a modest 3-bedroom house. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, but mine. Every mortgage payment felt like a private answer to every year I had been treated like less. No handouts, no disappearing loans, no rescue plan, just work, planning, exhaustion, and discipline. Signing those closing papers remains one of the best days of my life because the silence in that room felt different from the silence in my childhood home. That silence was peace. And while I was building something solid, Kayla's life had already become a revolving door of disasters, waiting for someone else to finance the damage. Kayla could never hold a job longer than 6 months. There was always a reason, always a speech, always some dramatic explanation that conveniently made everything somebody else's fault. She was late too often, or had an attitude mismatch with management, or claimed the job was beneath her, or said the schedule was impossible, or insisted her boss was threatened by her personality. Every story ended the same way. She lost the job, came home angry, and my parents treated her like she had survived a tragedy instead of just colliding with the most basic expectations of adult life. Then there was the housing history, which somehow got more ridiculous every year. Eviction number 1 happened when Kayla was 24. She rented a studio apartment, stopped paying rent after 3 months, and told my parents it was because she disagreed with the landlord's energy. I still remember hearing that and staring at the wall for a full 5 seconds because I honestly thought I had misheard her. But no, that was the phrase. The landlord's energy. As far as I could tell, the only aggressive thing that man had done was expect rent on time. My parents paid off the back rent, covered the late fees, and brought Kayla back home like a wounded soldier returning from war. That first return lasted around 8 months. During that time, Kayla did absolutely nothing. No job hunt, no class, no training, no actual movement toward a life. She stayed up gaming until 4 in the morning, slept until noon, wandered into the kitchen asking what there was to eat, then disappeared back into her room like a moody teenager in a 30-year-old body. My parents would complain to each other in these exhausted whispers, but never to her, never directly, never with consequences. "She's recovering from a difficult season," my mother would say. Recovering from what exactly was never clear. Not paying bills? Ignoring responsibilities? Being mildly inconvenienced by adulthood? Eviction number 2 came when Kayla was 27. By then, she had moved in with a boyfriend named Daniel. He was one of those men who looked permanently tired, the kind of person who had probably mistaken caregiving for love. Nice enough. Too nice, honestly. He worked long shifts and paid most of the bills, while Kayla drifted around their apartment, contributing complaints, emotional weather, and apparently a dangerous amount of confidence for someone whose main daily task was opening delivery apps. According to my parents, Daniel was controlling. According to Daniel, who I only heard from once through an accidental voicemail he left during one of their fights, he was exhausted. Turns out he had been covering rent, groceries, utilities, and gas, while Kayla sat at home insisting she was figuring things out. When he finally threw her out, she owed him 3 months of utility money and had somehow turned his kindness into one more story about how men always disappointed her. My parents paid him back too. That became the pattern. Not rescue, maintenance. They weren't helping Kayla survive a rough patch. They were financing the illusion that she could live without growing up. Her second return home was even worse than the first. By then she had developed a certain entitlement about it, like her presence in my parents' house was a favor she was doing for them. She ate their food, ignored every household chore, drove up their bills, and still found energy to complain about the brands of chips my mother bought. I heard her once, during one of my rare visits, standing in the kitchen saying, "These aren't the kind I like." I nearly laughed out loud. Imagine freeloading that aggressively and still thinking you were in a position to have snack preferences. Eviction number 3 happened last year. Kayla had talked a friend of hers, a woman named Brianna, into letting her stay rent-free in exchange for helping around the apartment. Kayla's idea of helping, apparently, involved eating most of the food, leaving dishes in the sink until they started looking biological, and deciding that wiping down a counter once a week counted as domestic contribution. Brianna gave her 2 weeks' notice. Kayla stretched that into 2 months. In the end, Brianna changed the locks while Kayla was out and left her duffel bags with the front desk. Every single time, my parents reacted like this was all a string of tragic misunderstandings. Bad luck, the economy, toxic roommates, unreasonable expectations, the universe being unfair to their daughter, never the obvious truth. Never the plain, ugly, unavoidable truth that Kayla was a grown woman who had never once been allowed to feel the full weight of a consequence because they had rushed in to cushion every fall before she ever hit the ground. After eviction number 3, she moved back in with them again. By then, my parents were pushing their late 50s and talking constantly about retirement. They were tired, stressed, ready for peace, as my mother liked to say. But somehow, in the middle of all this, there was still Kayla, camped out in her childhood bedroom, like time had politely waited for her to become responsible and then simply gotten bored and left. They would call me just to complain about her. Not because they wanted advice, not because they wanted honesty. They wanted me to participate in this ritual where they vented about the monster they had made without ever admitting they had raised it. Kayla's struggling. Kayla just needs the right opportunity. Kayla has so much potential if someone would just believe in her. The opportunity Kayla needed was a boundary. The belief she needed was the kind that refuses to confuse enabling with love. But my parents were incapable of that distinction. They had spent 3 decades making sure she never had to grow up, and now they were shocked that she hadn't. I mostly stayed out of it. That had become my specialty. Distance. I sent cards on holidays, I called on birthdays, I visited maybe twice a year for those awkward family dinners where nothing real was ever said until suddenly something wildly inappropriate was. Kayla usually used those dinners to ask me for money, always casually, as if she were borrowing a sweater. "Could you spot me a few hundred until next week? Would it kill you to help me out just this once? You make engineer money, May. It's not like you'd even notice." I always said no. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just no. That drove her crazy more than anger ever would have. My refusal wasn't emotional enough to make me the villain she wanted. It was steady, final, immovable. She'd roll her eyes, call me uptight, say I thought I was better than everyone else. I'd sip my drink and let the silence sit there until somebody changed the subject. My relationship with my parents by then was polite but distant, and that distance felt healthy. Necessary, even. I had made peace with who they were a long time ago. Not acceptance exactly. More like emotional weatherproofing. If you know a storm is always coming, you stop dressing for sunshine. Then, about 8 months ago, my parents dropped the kind of news at dinner that sounds harmless for exactly 3 seconds before the real meaning lands. We were sitting around their kitchen table. Same old house, same yellow light over the sink, same collection of framed family photos where Kayla somehow always looked like the center of the universe, even in group shots. My mother announced, with a smile that felt rehearsed, that they were selling the house and moving to a condo in Arizona near her sister. Honestly, it made sense. They were late 50s. The house was too big. The winters in Ohio were miserable. Arizona sounded like a reasonable retirement move for people who wanted sun, less maintenance, and the comforting illusion of starting fresh in a zip code where nobody knew their family business. So I said what any normal daughter would say. "Congratulations. That sounds like a good plan. Then my mother smiled in that careful, too light way that always meant the real conversation was just starting. So obviously, Kayla will need somewhere to stay. She said it like she was commenting on traffic, like this was a naturally occurring fact of life. Rain falls, taxes happen. Kayla requires housing from other people. I set my water glass down very slowly. My father leaned back in his chair, already wearing that expression he got whenever he assumed I would be reasonable in exactly the way that benefited him. We thought since you have that extra bedroom, she could move in with you temporarily, just until she gets on her feet. I almost laughed, but the sound got trapped somewhere between disbelief and anger. The extra bedrooms in my house were not empty space waiting to be claimed by family decree. One was my home office, where I did freelance consulting on weekends and brought in an extra $15,000 a year. The other was a guest room that I used rarely, but by actual guests. Neither room was a holding cell for my sister's unresolved life. That's not going to work for me, I said. The room changed instantly. My father's face did that thing it always did when I had an opinion about my own life. Confusion first, then irritation, as if individuality itself was disrespectful. Why not? You have the space. Having space and wanting a roommate are two different things. What I meant was I enjoy paying my bills, sleeping in peace, and living in a home that doesn't smell like entitlement and stale takeout, but I was trying for once to keep it diplomatic. Kayla was sitting across from me, barely participating, scrolling through her phone as if a conversation about her entire future living situation had absolutely nothing to do with her. That was Kayla in one image. Let everyone else manage the logistics while she remained emotionally unavailable to her own consequences. It would only be temporary, my mother said quickly. 6 months, maybe a year, just until Kayla saves up. 6 months to a year. I stared at her. Kayla had spent the better part of a decade floating in and out of free housing, prepaid rent, borrowed money, forgiven debt, and parental rescue. Any money that landed in her hands evaporated into delivery food, impulse purchases, late-night online shopping, and whatever shiny distraction gave her the illusion of momentum for 48 hours. The idea that my house would suddenly transform her into a disciplined adult was so absurd it almost felt insulting to reality itself. "I'm sorry," I said, and my voice was calm enough to irritate all three of them, "but no, I'm not in a position to take on a roommate." That was corporate language. Clean, controlled, bloodless. Because direct honesty with my parents never created understanding. It just created volume. Dinner got strange after that. They tried every angle. Kayla could help around the house. Kayla needed stability. I could be a positive influence. Living with me would inspire her. My father even said, with a straight face, that having family nearby might be good for me, as though my well-organized home had been aching for the specific chaos of my sister wandering through it in pajama pants at 2 p.m. The image of Kayla helping around my house was almost enough to break my composure. This was a woman who once went 3 weeks without doing laundry because she kept forgetting the washing machine existed. She would help around my house the way a tornado helps landscaping. I held firm. No. And when I left that night, my parents looked at me like I had betrayed them. Not disappointed, not surprised, betrayed. Like I had failed some sacred, unwritten contract in which everything I built belonged to the family the moment they decided they needed it more. Kayla barely looked up from her phone. She just shrugged and kept scrolling. My parents moved to Arizona about 4 months after that dinner. They sold the house faster than expected, packed up 3 decades of furniture and memories, and drove west like retirees escaping winter. On the surface, everything looked perfectly normal. Sun, golf courses, quiet condos, a slower pace of life. They kept telling people they were excited for this new chapter. Fresh start, less stress. But before they left Ohio, they made sure Kayla was taken care of. They found her a small apartment not far from their old neighborhood and paid the first 3 months of rent, plus the security deposit. My mother described it to me over the phone like it was some kind of thoughtful farewell gift. "Just a little support while she gets back on her feet," she said. You can probably guess how that turned out. Kayla lasted 2.5 months. Eviction number 4. The landlord's report was almost impressive in its variety. Noise complaints from neighbors because she had people over 3 or 4 nights a week, blasting music until 3 a.m. Damage to the bathroom wall that Kayla insisted had already been weak before she touched it. According to the photos the landlord sent my parents, the hole in the drywall looked suspiciously like the size of a fist. The rent? Paid exactly 0 times once the prepaid months ran out. My parents called me the day the eviction happened. My mother was practically hysterical. I could hear her breathing fast through the phone, the way she always did when she was preparing to turn something into an emotional emergency. May, she has nowhere to go. She's going to end up on the street. Before I could answer, my father took the phone. He used his serious voice, the one he always thought sounded commanding, but mostly just sounded like he was trying to win an argument with gravity. You need to let Kayla stay with you. Not asked. Told. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. No, she's your sister. I am aware. This is what family does. Family. The word always arrived like a weapon in these conversations. Family doesn't mean I have to let someone move into my house against my will, I said. Kayla is 31 years old. She needs to figure out her own situation. My mother grabbed the phone again. How can you be so cold after everything we've done for you? That one almost made me laugh out loud. Everything they'd done for me. If I started listing those things honestly, it would be a very short document. The call turned into what these calls always turned into. Accusations, guilt, emotional theater. Apparently, I was abandoning my family. Apparently, I was punishing Kayla for making mistakes, as if 4 evictions and years of freeloading were the sort of harmless accidents that happen to everyone occasionally. I told them my answer was final. Then I ended the call. After that, I blocked their numbers for 48 hours, because sometimes silence is the only way to stop a conversation from turning into psychological demolition. For a couple of weeks, things were quiet. Then the extended family arrived. Apparently, my parents had decided if they couldn't move me directly, they would surround me with people who thought they had a moral right to weigh in. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly felt deeply invested in my character development. An aunt texted me a Bible verse about brotherly love. A cousin I had met maybe twice tried to add me on social media so she could send long messages about compassion and sacrifice. One uncle left me a voicemail explaining how important it was for families to stick together during difficult times. Even my grandmother called. That one was harder because I actually love her. She didn't lecture me. She didn't accuse me. She just spoke softly and suggested that sometimes helping family meant doing things we didn't necessarily want to do. I told her the whole story. Not the emotional version my parents had clearly been distributing. The real one. The evictions, the money transfers, the way Kayla had been rescued from every consequence since high school. The way my parents had tried to volunteer my house like it was a public shelter they happened to own. Grandma listened quietly. At the end, she sighed and said she understood why I was tired, even if she still hoped my heart would stay open. That conversation stayed with me for a while. Kayla tried a different strategy. She started calling me directly. Her tone was completely different from my parents'. No guilt, no speeches about family duty, just promises. She had changed. She had learned from everything that happened. She was ready to start over. She would get a job immediately. She would pay rent. She would stay out of my way so much I'd barely notice she lived there. I listened to all of it. Then I said no. Every time. My house, my decision. Eventually, the calls slowed down. And for a brief moment, I thought maybe that was the end of it. That maybe the message had finally landed. That maybe my parents had realized they couldn't force a grown woman into someone else's home just because they had run out of patience funding her life. I underestimated them. About 6 weeks after the eviction, I got a letter in the mail that made me laugh out loud the moment I opened it. It was from a law office I had never heard of. The paper was heavy. The fonts were dramatic. The language was trying very hard to sound important. According to the letter, my parents were considering legal action against me for something called familial abandonment and breach of implied familial duty. I read the sentence 3 times. Then I read it again. My parents were threatening to sue me because I wouldn't let my 31-year-old sister move into my house. I called a friend from college who had gone into law. He was quiet for about 10 seconds after I explained the situation. Then he started laughing. May, he said, familial abandonment isn't really a thing in civil law, not like they're describing. There's no rule that says you have to house your adult sibling. So they're bluffing? Either that, he said, or they found a lawyer willing to take their money for a case that's going nowhere. He told me I should respond through an attorney anyway, just to make it clear I wasn't intimidated. So I hired a local lawyer named Richard who handled general civil cases. Richard read the letter once. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, this is creative." He drafted a response explaining that there was no legal basis for any of the claims, and that any lawsuit filed on those grounds would be considered frivolous. I assumed that would end it. Normal people would read that kind of response and realize the situation had reached the edge of reality. My parents are not normal people. 2 weeks later, a process server knocked on my door. He handed me an envelope with actual court papers inside. My parents were suing me for $50,000. I stood in my kitchen holding the envelope for a full minute before I even opened it. Not because I was scared, more because I was trying to decide whether this was real life or some elaborate prank designed specifically to test my patience. $50,000. That was the number printed on the complaint. My parents were suing me for intentional infliction of emotional distress and negligent failure to provide familial support. According to the paperwork, my refusal to allow Kayla to live in my house had caused them severe emotional trauma and forced them to spend significant money continuing to support her. I read the document twice. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes the human brain runs out of more appropriate reactions. The irony was so thick you could have spread it on toast. My parents had been financially supporting Kayla for years. They had covered every eviction, every unpaid bill, every broken lease, every chaotic detour of her adult life. But somehow, according to this lawsuit, my refusal to take over that responsibility had suddenly become the real problem. I called Richard. He read through the complaint the same afternoon. "This is garbage," he said plainly. "There's no cause of action here. They're suing you for not being generous enough with your own property. No judge is going to take this seriously." "Then why file it?" He shrugged. "Sometimes people think if they push hard enough, the legal system will force reality to match what they want. Even if the case was ridiculous, we still had to respond. Paperwork had to be filed, motions prepared, deadlines met. Lawyers love deadlines the way toddlers love snacks, constantly and without mercy." Then came discovery. That's where things started getting interesting. Richard sent requests for documents related to their claims. Financial records, any proof of the expenses they claimed my refusal had caused, emails, statements, anything that could explain the $50,000 number they had pulled out of thin air. What came back was better than anything we could have asked for. Bank statements first. 5 years' worth of transfers from my parents to Kayla. Not occasional help. Regular payments. $500 here, $800 there, sometimes $1,200, month after month after month. Over 5 years, it added up to roughly $45,000. $45,000. That's a down payment on a house. That's a graduate degree. That's an entire safety net if someone uses it wisely. Instead, it had funded Kayla's extended teenage years. But the real discovery gold wasn't the money. It was the emails. Richard called me into his office the day he read them. He had that expression lawyers get when they realize the opposing side has just accidentally handed them the entire case. "These," he said, sliding a printed stack across the desk, "are remarkable. The emails were between my parents, private conversations, and in them, they openly discussed their retirement plans. More specifically, they discussed how they expected me to take over Kayla's financial support once they moved to Arizona. They talked about my house having plenty of room. They talked about me being stable enough to handle Kayla's expenses. They even calculated how much money they would save if Kayla lived with me, instead of needing their monthly transfers. One email from my mother to my father said it perfectly. Once she's settled at May's place, we can finally stop worrying about the monthly payments." I stared at that line for a long time. The lawsuit wasn't about emotional distress. It wasn't about family duty. It was about money. They had a plan. They expected to retire peacefully in Arizona while I quietly inherited the financial responsibility of the daughter they had raised to depend on them. And when I said no, they tried to force the plan through the legal system. Richard was practically buzzing. "This proves motive," he said. "They're claiming emotional harm, but these emails show the real issue is financial. They wanted to transfer Kayla's expenses to you. So they sued me when I refused." Exactly. From there, we built the defense carefully. We documented Kayla's eviction history. 4 evictions, unpaid rent, property damage. Richard even contacted one of the former landlords who sent us a detailed breakdown of repairs that had cost him $3,000 after Kayla moved out. We pulled employment records showing she had never held a job longer than a few months. Every document painted the same picture. Kayla wasn't unlucky. She was chronically irresponsible. Richard also sent written questions back to my parents, asking them to cite any law that required one adult sibling to provide housing for another. Their responses were emotional paragraphs: family obligation, moral duty, responsibility to blood. But not a single statute, not a single legal precedent, because none existed. The whole case was obviously going nowhere. But my parents had already committed, and pride is a powerful drug. The court date was scheduled for early fall, a Tuesday morning. Richard told me not to worry. "Judges see family disputes all the time," he said, "but they don't like being used as leverage." Still, the weeks leading up to the hearing felt strange. Not stressful exactly, just surreal. The idea that I was preparing for court because I refused to let my 31-year-old sister move into my house felt like the plot of a bad television drama. And yet, there it was. Real paperwork, real court, real accusations. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. Not because I thought I might lose, because part of me still couldn't believe my parents had taken things this far. The next morning, I put on my best business casual outfit. Simple dress, clean jacket. The responsible adult look I had spent my entire life building. When I arrived at the courthouse, they were already there. My mother, my father, and Kayla. My mother wouldn't look at me. My father stared like I had personally insulted generations of our ancestors. Kayla was sitting in a chair, scrolling through her phone. Of course she was. Their lawyer looked like a man who had emotionally retired 10 years ago and was just physically finishing the job. He kept shuffling papers and checking his watch. The judge hadn't arrived yet. But I had a feeling the next hour was about to become the most ridiculous chapter of this entire story. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected. Not the dramatic, echoing place you see in movies. Just a quiet room with wooden benches, a raised desk for the judge, and a few rows of chairs where people waited for their turn to argue about their lives. Richard and I sat at our table while my parents and their lawyer sat across from us. Kayla was behind them, slouched in her chair, like she was waiting for a delayed flight, rather than participating in a lawsuit built entirely around her existence. The judge walked in a few minutes later. She looked like a woman who had seen every possible version of family chaos and had very little patience left for new variations. Mid-50s, calm face, sharp eyes. When she began reading through the case file before the hearing officially started, I caught a quick movement of her eyebrows. Not a good sign for my parents. Their lawyer spoke first. He stood up slowly, cleared his throat, and began explaining the case with all the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. He talked about family bonds, moral responsibility, the emotional trauma of watching a daughter abandon her sister. Words like compassion and duty floated around the room like they were supposed to be evidence. What he never mentioned was any actual law. Not once did he point to a statute, a precedent, or even a legal principle that required me to house my adult sister. It was all feelings. When he finished, Richard stood up. Richard had a very different tone, calm, organized, precise. He started with the simplest fact. There is no legal requirement for one adult to provide housing for another adult sibling. Then he walked the judge through Kayla's eviction history. 4 evictions, noise complaints, unpaid rent, property damage. He showed the repair report from one landlord who spent $3,000 fixing an apartment after Kayla moved out. Then Richard pulled out the emails. The ones where my parents discussed their plan to transfer Kayla's expenses to me once they moved to Arizona. Your Honor, he said, the plaintiffs are not seeking justice. They are attempting to use the court system to force my client to take over the financial responsibility of another adult. The evidence shows their motivation is economic, not emotional. The judge looked unimpressed with my parents' side. Then she turned directly to their lawyer. Can you cite any legal authority that requires a person to provide housing to an adult sibling? The man hesitated. He mentioned something about the spirit of family unity, something about common law traditions. The judge waited. He never answered the actual question. Finally, she said, I'd like to hear from Miss Kayla Espinoza. Kayla stood up and walked to the witness chair like someone reluctantly volunteering to answer a question in class. She raised her hand, took the oath, and sat down. For the first few minutes, everything went smoothly from my parents' side. Their lawyer asked simple questions. How long have you been looking for housing? What is your current employment situation? How has your sister's refusal affected you? Kayla answered with vague, dramatic language. She had been exploring options. She was between opportunities. My refusal had been deeply hurtful because family was supposed to support each other. Listening to her talk was almost impressive. She had turned confusion into an art form. Then Richard stood up. This was the moment everything changed. He started by walking through the eviction history, one by one, each landlord, each complaint, each unpaid lease. Kayla tried to minimize everything, but the documents were right there in front of the judge. 4 evictions. Clear pattern. Then Richard asked a simple question. Kayla, where are you currently living? She shrugged. With my friend Jessica. She's letting me crash on her couch until this gets sorted out. Richard paused. So you are not homeless? No. You are not living on the street? No. But the lawsuit claims you would be homeless if your sister did not house you. Kayla blinked. I've been staying with Jessica for like 2 months. It's fine. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. Their lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Richard continued. And Kayla, do you understand the purpose of this lawsuit? Kayla leaned back in the chair like she was explaining something obvious. Yeah. And what do you understand that purpose to be? Kayla shrugged again. Well, my parents are on a fixed income now. They can't keep paying for everything for me. So they figured if the court made May let me stay at her place, it would save them like $1,000 a month or something. The room went silent. Complete silence. Kayla kept talking. Plus, May has that house with extra rooms she's not even using, so it's kind of a waste anyway. I watched my parents' faces. My mother looked like someone had unplugged her from reality. My father's expression turned a color I had never seen before. Their lawyer closed his eyes. The judge leaned forward slowly. "Let me make sure I understand," she said. "You're saying your parents filed this lawsuit because they wanted to save money by having your sister cover your living expenses?" Kayla nodded. "Yeah, pretty much." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from smiling. 31 years of chaos. 31 years of excuses. And Kayla had just destroyed the entire case in less than 30 seconds because she couldn't stop talking. The judge called a short recess. When we came back into the courtroom, she didn't waste time. "I have heard enough," she said. "The plaintiffs have failed to establish any legal basis for their claims. There is no law requiring one adult to house another adult sibling." She looked directly at my parents. "What concerns me more is the clear attempt to use this court to force one family member to financially support another." She turned toward me. "Your daughter has every legal right to decide who lives in her home." Then she delivered the sentence that ended everything. Case dismissed with prejudice. But she wasn't finished. "Given the frivolous nature of this lawsuit, the plaintiffs will also be responsible for the defendant's legal fees." The total came to about $8,000. My mother started crying immediately. My father looked like he wanted to break something. Kayla was already back on her phone. I walked out of that courtroom feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time in my life, reality had been spoken out loud in front of my entire family. And it hadn't come from me. It had come from a judge. But the story still wasn't over. Not even close. The first thing my parents did after losing the case was write me a letter. Not an email, not a text. A 4-page handwritten letter from my mother that arrived in my mailbox about a week after the court ruling. I sat at my kitchen table and read it slowly. Every page was soaked in guilt. They were on a fixed income now. They could not afford the $8,000 the judge had ordered them to pay. Retirement was already stressful. Arizona was expensive. Life had been hard on them. Then she listed everything they had ever spent on Kayla. Car repairs, rent deposits, utility bills, food, support during difficult seasons. The total number she wrote was almost surreal. Reading it felt like watching someone accidentally confess to the entire problem without realizing it. The letter ended with a line that I think my mother believed was powerful. "We are still your parents and we deserve your respect." I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and mailed it straight to Richard. His response to them was about as professional as legal language allows, while still basically saying absolutely not. "Judgment stands. Payment expected within 30 days. 30 days came and went. My parents paid nothing. Richard filed a motion to enforce the judgment. The court approved it. A garnishment order was issued on my father's pension. About $450 a month would now be automatically taken until the $8,000 was paid in full. My mother called me the day the garnishment started. She was screaming so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "You are stealing from our retirement." I waited for her to run out of air. Then I said calmly, "You could have avoided all of this by not suing me." She hung up. A few weeks later, Kayla got kicked out again. This time it was Jessica's place. She had lasted almost 3 months, which was actually a personal record for her. Apparently, Jessica had eventually heard about the eviction history through someone who knew someone connected to the court case. She gave Kayla a week to leave. Kayla called me that night. Her voice was completely different this time. No arrogance, no attitude, just desperation. "May, can I stay at your place for a few days? Just until I figure something out?" No. She swore at me, called me selfish, said I thought I was better than everyone. Then she hung up. 2 days later, she showed up at my house. It was around 9 in the evening. I heard the doorbell and checked the camera on my phone. Kayla was standing on my porch with a duffel bag. It was raining. When I opened the door, she looked exhausted. "Dave kicked me out," she said quietly. "Mom and Dad are in Arizona. I've got nowhere else to go." I stood in the doorway. "You can't stay here." Her face changed immediately. "You're serious?" "Yes." She started yelling, calling me every name she could think of, saying blood was supposed to mean something, saying I owed her because I had always had things easier. That last part almost made me laugh. One of my neighbors opened his door to see what was happening. I waved to let him know everything was fine. Kayla noticed and lowered her voice slightly. Then she switched tactics. "Fine," she said. "I'll sleep on the porch. Just one night. I'll be gone in the morning." "No." I stepped inside and closed the door. A few seconds later, she started banging on it. I picked up my phone and called the non-emergency police line just to document what was happening. She must have seen me through the window because she grabbed her bag and walked off before the officers arrived. The next day, I installed a doorbell camera. 2 weeks later, my parents flew back from Arizona. Apparently, they were now staying in a cheap motel near their old neighborhood while they tried to help Kayla get back on her feet. My mother called to tell me this, like it was supposed to make me feel guilty. I asked how the retirement condo was going. She said they might have to sell it to keep supporting Kayla. I told her that sounded like a personal problem. She called me heartless and hung up. Then came the intervention. Saturday morning. I was getting ready for work when the doorbell rang. I checked the camera. All three of them were standing on my porch. My parents and Kayla. They had apparently driven all night from their motel. My father was holding a thick folder. My mother's mascara was already streaked down her face. Kayla looked annoyed to be awake before noon. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. No chance I was letting them inside. I pointed at the camera. "This is recording." My father started talking immediately. It was obviously a speech he had rehearsed in the car. Family responsibility. Blood thicker than water. How my selfishness was tearing everyone apart. He opened the folder and started pulling out papers. Bank statements. Bills. Spreadsheets of everything they had spent on Kayla. "If you just let her stay 6 months," he said, "maybe a year, we can save the condo. We can retire peacefully." My mother jumped in between sobs. She reminded me she had carried me for 9 months. Reminded me how she stayed up when I was sick as a child. Reminded me she drove me to school. Like basic parenting was some kind of lifelong debt. Kayla stood behind them, scrolling through her phone. Completely uninterested. I let them talk. 10 minutes. I didn't interrupt once. Then I asked one question. "Did you bring any documents showing what you sacrificed for me?" My father opened his mouth, closed it, looked at my mother. She stared at the ground. Kayla actually laughed. "Dude, seriously?" I kept my eyes on my parents. "And this is the last time we are having this conversation," I said. "I am not housing Kayla. I am not funding Kayla. I am not rescuing Kayla. If you want to keep enabling a 31-year-old woman who refuses to grow up, that's your choice. But it will never be my responsibility." My mother started the kind of crying that used to destroy me when I was a kid. It didn't work anymore. Kayla rolled her eyes. "My God, May, you're such a tool." My father's face turned the deep red I remembered from childhood. "You're going to regret this," he said. "When you're old and alone, don't expect family to be there for you." I cut him off. "You have 2 choices. You accept my decision and we try to have some kind of relationship, or you keep pushing this and I cut contact completely. No calls, no letters, no showing up here. Your choice." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he threw the folder onto the porch. Papers scattered everywhere. Bills, statements, all the evidence of the life they had built around Kayla. He stormed back to the car. My mother followed him, still crying. Kayla flipped me off as she walked away. The car peeled out of my driveway like they were escaping a crime scene. I picked up the folder, walked inside, and dropped the entire stack into the recycling bin without reading a single page. That was 5 days ago, and I haven't heard from any of them since. The quiet after that morning was almost strange. For the first time in months, there were no calls, no texts, no relatives suddenly rediscovering my number to remind me what family was supposed to mean. My phone stayed silent. My house stayed peaceful. The tension that had been sitting on my shoulders for most of the year slowly started to fade. 5 days passed, then 2 weeks. Nothing. And I realized something I probably should have understood years earlier. Silence can feel like freedom. Life moved forward in small, ordinary ways that suddenly felt bigger because they weren't constantly interrupted by chaos. I kept working. The engineering project my team had been pushing for months finally wrapped up successfully, and the promotion my manager had hinted about became official. Senior mechanical engineer, 15% raise. The timing was almost funny. The same week Kayla got kicked out of Jessica's place and showed up banging on my door, my career quietly stepped up another level. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor. My house stayed exactly the way I liked it. Quiet in the mornings, clean kitchen counters, no arguments echoing down the hallway, no random people showing up at midnight because someone decided to throw a party. Peace turned out to be the best decoration a house could have. About 3 weeks after the porch incident, my grandmother called again. Her voice sounded softer than usual. "I heard what happened," she said. Apparently, my aunt had already told her the dramatic version of the story. According to that version, I had slammed the door on my crying parents and abandoned my sister while she was completely helpless. Grandma asked for my side, so I told her everything. The emails my parents had written planning to move Kayla into my house. The lawsuit. The court hearing. Kayla accidentally admitting the real reason for the case. The judge dismissing it. The legal fees. The porch confrontation. I didn't rush the story. I let the details sit there exactly as they were. When I finished, there was a long silence on the phone. Then my grandmother sighed. "I warned your father about this years ago," she said quietly. "About what?" "About protecting Kayla from every consequence. I told him one day she would grow up expecting the world to carry her." She paused. "And I told him it wouldn't be fair to you." Hearing that from someone in my family meant more than I expected. Not because it fixed anything, but because it proved that at least one person had seen what was happening all those years. "You didn't do anything wrong, May," she said gently. "Sometimes love means refusing to participate in someone else's mistakes." We talked for a while longer. When we hung up, I sat on my couch thinking about how strange it was that the most honest conversation I had ever had with a family member happened when I was almost 30. A few days later, something else unexpected happened. I had a date. There's a woman from my gym named Daniel. Yes, his name is Daniel. It confused me the first time someone said it too. He's the quiet type, friendly, patient, the kind of man who listens more than he talks and laughs easily when something surprises him. We had been talking after workouts for a couple of months before everything with the lawsuit exploded, and eventually he asked if I wanted to grab dinner. I told him the short version of the story while we were eating, not the whole legal saga, just enough to explain why I suddenly had a doorbell camera and a very firm policy about surprise visitors. He laughed so hard at the part where Kayla accidentally destroyed the case in court that the waiter came over to see if everything was okay. "Your sister admitted that under oath?" he asked. "Word for word." He shook his head, still smiling. That might be the most accidental hero moment I've ever heard. The date went well. Better than well, actually. We planned another one for the following weekend. I'm not saying anything dramatic about the future, but it felt nice to talk about normal things again. Work, travel, movies, life outside of family chaos. One evening a few weeks later, I was sitting on my back porch when a thought crossed my mind that made me laugh. For most of my childhood, I had been the invisible kid, the one who didn't get the big celebrations, the one who was expected to succeed quietly while someone else received the spotlight. But somehow, by the time we were all adults, the roles had flipped in a strange way. Kayla had spent 31 years being protected from consequences, and the moment those consequences finally arrived, she had no idea how to face them. Meanwhile, I had spent the same years learning how to stand on my own. Turns out that skill ages pretty well. The last thing I'll say about all of this is something people kept repeating after the story started spreading online. Blood is thicker than water. Most people use that phrase to argue that family loyalty should come before everything else. But the original saying actually means the opposite. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. The relationships we choose, the boundaries we protect, the values we build for ourselves, those matter more than the accidents of birth. Right now, my house is quiet. My savings account looks good. My promotion starts next month. And there's a second date on my calendar. For the first time in a long time, life feels simple. And honestly, simple feels pretty great.